Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Elizabeth Garber-Paul. I'm the culture editor for Rolling Stone magazine. And it's my pleasure to be here today with Isabel Benke and Omar Wasow. We are going to be talking about social media. Let me introduce our panelists, though. Omar is assistant professor in the politics department at Pomona College. He's known for his regular appearances on NPR, The Today Show, MSNBC, as well as co-founding BlackPlanet.com in the late 1990s, which has grown into one of the largest, the largest Black social network, serving millions of African Americans a month. More recently, Omar published one of the most discussed social science papers of 2020, which overviewed the political consequences of nonviolent and violent protests of the 1960s. He has a PhD in African American Studies, along with a master's degree in Statistics and Government. Isabel is a field ethnologist who studies the social behaviors of primates and has walked more than 3,000 kilometers in the Congo studying wild bonobos, one of humans' closest living relatives. She is a TED Fellow, has a PhD from Oxford in evolutionary anthropology, and a master's in philosophy in human evolution from Cambridge. Those are just a few of her many degrees and appointments. She is joining us today to provide perspective on how social media engages us on our most basic human levels. So to get started, let's just talk about social media itself and what attracts people to social media.
Well, why don't let me offer a little bit of my origin story with like how I got interested in social media. And I kind of came of age in the sort of Jurassic era of like social media when my dad came home one year with the first edition Mac and a 1200 baud modem, which like allowed text to load slowly. And it was like magic. And I was just totally drawn in to a world of what were hobbyists at the time, people who set up in their own homes a modem, and you would call in and interact with people. And this was in junior high school and high school. And I thought like it was just, for me, this very powerful thing to have these social experiences through a computer. To be clear, I was then and continue to be a nerd, but it like was something really special. And when I came out of college, there was lots of discussion about, Al Gore was talking about the information superhighway. And I thought, no, like that's not what's powerful here. What's powerful is kind of the supper club, is this opportunity to feel a sense of connection to other people, to exchange ideas, to make friends, to flirt. And so it was out of that early experience of like what drew me in was people, was what led to starting first a company called New York Online, and then Black Planet. And now it seems totally obvious, but for the better part of a decade, the dominant idea of the internet was it was going to be a library, right? It was going to be like this big collection. It was going to be Wikipedia. And that was what people were going to be like, the primary use. And it wasn't going to be Facebook. And so I think it's in some ways, people had to hack the internet, right? I mean, if you think about what a web page, like the whole metaphor was, it was books and pages, and people hacked it to make it social. And so that's sort of where I came into it, was with Black Planet. We were hacking the internet to like add a social layer to the web.
That's funny. I had forgotten that the internet was supposed to be a library, but I think if you would have asked a primatologist about that project, they would have immediately told you, duh, no, it's never going to be a library. It's obviously going to be mainly for social life. And that's because we know the forces that have shaped humans, and that's why we studied, say, the last 5 million years. And as a species, we are obsessed with each other. We are social animals. So, of course, the ideas of the Enlightenment are that we are rational beings, and we value, of course, and rightly, our brains, our rationality so much. But I think until we really take into account the kind of human nature 2.0, why we are like we are, and how are we, namely that we are primates, we are social apes, and all that comes from that, we can make actually predictions that are better, namely the internet will be a place for social obsession, and also we will live perhaps more easily with ourselves. But basically, I think that's what we're seeing now, that it's like the social animal unraveled with this incredible, powerful tool.
And Omar, what were the kinds of conversations that you saw on those early iterations of social media?
I mean, it's not, in some ways, what's remarkable is how similar it is now to what it was then, right? People built profiles and they, speaking of like primal things, people were flirting, right? They were, they were trying to hook up. They were, one funny side note, when I started my first company, New York Online, we had 20 phone lines coming into my apartment in Brooklyn. And it was such a weird thing for the phone company that somebody would have 20 phone lines hooked into these modems that they thought I was running a phone sex operation. and I was like, no, you can't, it's like a 1-bedroom apartment. You couldn't fit 20 people in here. But like, that speaks to, in some ways, the like persistence of certain kinds of things. Like, we are social, we want to make friends, we want approval, we want status. And so, in the text-based world, it was still seeking status. It was still trying to impress people, but it was like, if you were a good writer, that was what gained you status. The Rolling Stone culture editor approves noddingly. Nods approvingly. Sorry. So it's like, yeah. So it's very similar in that way. But the sources of status change, right? So now on Instagram, it's like, can you present like a beautiful photo as opposed to a beautiful sentence, is what it might have been, 20 years ago.
Sure.
And you said it beautifully, and I think the key is to remember that that will continue to happen. To pretend that we can erase certain aspects of human nature, it's both ignorant and will go nowhere. We will always compete, we will also always cooperate, and we will always seek for status. I think what we can do is actually change the meaning of what certain status markers are. I guess a good example, the writing versus taking photos, or being a car driver, or doing something good for the environment, etc., etc. But once you kind of accept that part of human nature, that we are status obsessed, and that the meaning of that can change, there's a lot to be done, and also perhaps we can forgive each other a little bit more.
That leads into the next question, which is, what are the parts of human nature that are amplified by social media?
So I think one idea for me, this comes out of research by a scholar who has been at Microsoft Research, and the idea is context collapse, right? And so in a kind of pre-social media era, you could have one conversation with your coworkers, one conversation with your friends, one conversation with your family, and like, a joke you made with your friends wouldn't get you in trouble at work, or the way you might talk to your family wouldn't spill over to, that wouldn't be the expectation of how you talk to your friends. And what's happening with social media, the idea of context collapse, is that those worlds are like banging up against each other, right? On a place like Facebook, you might say something that, kind of a classic example, there was an incident a year ago, somebody's on vacation in Europe, posts a photo drinking wine, and got fired from the school she taught at in the United States, right? And it's like, that's context collapse, right? In pre-social media, there's no way drinking a glass of wine on vacation is going to like cause some violation of your like employment code in the United States, right? And that's happening again and again and again across all of these different forms. And so it means suddenly you've got to speak in the voice that's like not the lowest common denominator, but somehow the like least controversial voice across all those contexts. And that's not great either, right? And so, but it's very helpful, I think, to understand this idea of context collapse, because it's like, it's happening to everybody, and yet we often aren't describing it in those terms. And so for me, that's been really useful for making sense of like how social media has turned a very kind of common sort of social dynamic, having kind of private, discrete ways of interacting with different subgroups into something that's now like, this one, essentially one group.
That's perfect. I wasn't aware that you guys were using that term, but in anthropology and animal behavior studies, basically what we do is we look at the structure of societies. And what we have found is that human societies, like chimpanzee societies, bonobos, dolphins, elephants, and other animals, have societies that we call fission-fusion. Namely, you have a community, but the community is not always together. You are kind of like sub-communities that interact in different contexts. So, which is different, say, from a pack of wolves that you're hanging with your pack all the time. Humans, we're not like that. And bonobos and chimps are not like that. For example, you live in a house with, your subgroup of your family unit. You leave in the morning and then you go to work and then you interact with that sub-network. You go to lunch with your friends. On Friday, you see your school friends. Sunday, you go to church or whatever. And so those contexts of different subgroups are very important, and we interact differently with them. And for animals like us, it's part of our mental health is actually being able to do that. One of the problems that the pandemic had in areas where people had to be stuck at home, it was basically all deriving from the fact that we could not do exercise or fission-fusion. Namely, either you're alone, which is bad, social animals, it's very bad for us if we're alone, but also you're stuck with the same group all the time. We're not being able to exercise our fission-fusion, namely, just going for lunch and like spending time with a different subgroup, and that is healthy, and that's why we can joke and we can say certain things with our friends on Friday night, but we wouldn't do the same joke with our grandma on Sunday, or whatever other example you might find. So I think the context collapsed in relation to being able to know and exercise our fission-fusion sociality in a healthy way. It's very important, and obviously that ties into many of the other issues that we are seeing in social media, namely that it doesn't recognize this context and does not allow for this context.
It's interesting you bring up the pandemic, because I think that, when we were isolated, when we were spending time with these smaller groups, a lot of people did turn to the internet and to social networks in order to have those interactions. So I guess the question would be, what was it about going online that didn't fulfill those same kinds of human needs for us?
I mean, this is. I'm thinking about the first part of what you said, which was like, for it felt like months. It was just me and my wife in a box, and it's like that's and I love my wife, but it was like that we definitely stepped on each other's toes, and so but social media doesn't. And to be fair, I was teaching, so I had even a little bit more social interaction where it was like, I could kind of like, in these massive Zoom sessions. But I think at some core level, like, we're also physical beings, right? And it's like, there's just a lot to being in, the classic example is just like body language, right? It's like, there's so much of what's annoying about social media is people interacting in ways that they never would act in person, right? So it's like, that's not just a bad faith reading of somebody's post or something, but it's like somebody's trying to be sarcastic and somebody interprets it as not sarcastic, and then you've got like this super boring, highly conflictual exchange where it's like, oh, if you were in the same room, like that wouldn't have happened. And this is, to be clear, this is not just social media. I remember in my company, I used to encourage people who worked for me who would be two people would be having an escalating exchange. It's like, you sit on opposite sides of like an office, just like walk 100 feet and talk to that person, and that de-escalates so much. And so there's something, and you might have insight about this, but I don't fully understand the ways in which there's something about the absence of tone and body language often leads to escalation, or leads to bad faith readings, and that can be resolved in significant part if we can be in the same space, and we have to kind of sit with the like physical presence of another person and their feelings and their reactions. So one other subtle point here on the pandemic, I've been teaching now, and the rules at Pomona are in class we wear masks, and I've come to realize that like there's this very weird way where I impute the lower half of people's faces, and like when we step outside and we take our masks off, it's like, oh, you're a totally different person. you look, and so something about how the brain is like compensating for the absence of a full face is, I think, analogous to how the brain is compensating for the absence of a full body online, and those things can go quite awry.
Yeah, I think the key there is the absence of a full body, because we forget that it's not just our brains interacting with each other, and our bodies are actually not only made to take one brain to the next room. We are a whole animal, and it's really interesting to see how much we convey, and also we have such specific contextual rules for interaction. Like, think about the rules that are unspoken about last night in the context where you're in a party, and how that those rules of what you can say, how do you approach people, what's the right tone, and how different the rules are Monday 9 a.m. in a work meeting, and you're still the same person, and you can still be with the same people, but you're not going to do and say certain things. This is part of our animal nature. Dogs know that. Like, watch dogs playing in a park, and they have interactions that they can do a lot of harm to each other, right? Because they have teeth. But given that they're social animals, they have all the signals and go like, okay, now I'm playing, now I'm going to chase you. And there's very sophisticated, quick feedback loops of interaction that social animals know how to manage. In part, we are on one hand trying to norm this, which I think we will touch with the issue of cancel culture, which I think is obviously a lost endeavor, because we are capable of reading context. But the other part is that obviously the technology, how we have it now, allows us to do a lot, but not to read context. So I do think we're an interesting kind of like uncanny valley of development there. But new technology is emerging that is trying to take into account these things. For instance, we all know about Zoom fatigue, and why is because you're actually looking in front. You're not able to do this. Like, now you kind of see each other and you know where you're looking. And so there are some new designs that at least are trying to take, they're trying to put you in this kind of position. So I think it'll be interesting to see what happens there.
To touch on what you were saying a little bit before, one thing that we had talked about is the speed of culture and how that has changed with social media, because before it used to take a little bit longer for an idea to travel and to become accepted. And what is it about social media that has just really ramped it up so much?
I'm fascinated by this, and it's so I think this plays out in a couple of ways, right? So the idea of the speed of culture is that, like, in some pre-social media era, pick a fashion, right? There's like some, you've got really stylish shoes, and like that would have propagated from, Austin to, Chicago, and then LA or something. And that might have happened over years. And now we've got this process where it's like something pops and can peak and crash in it feels like weeks. And so then it becomes hard to keep up, right? And if it's just shoes, life goes on. But with other kinds of things, I was talking to the driver coming in last night, where he's like, I don't know how to shake people's hands right now. Do I shake hands? Do I fist bump? Do I elbow? Right? And so there are all of these things which are about literally a kind of social handshake, where we don't know quite and the rules are changing. And if the rules are changing, it means you can potentially say or do something that is in that particular context quite wrong. And with language, for example, that can be even more fraught, right? So it's like Latino, Hispanic, Latinx, right? It's like, am I going to give you the wrong handshake? And that's going to somehow lead to you sort of thinking like I'm, either not with it in a fashion sense, or somehow backward in a social sense. And of course, if the culture is moving at this very rapid pace, then it's exceedingly hard to even keep up or know quite what the standard is, right? Coming back to the handshake example. And the point is that social media, in the same way that it's contributing to this kind of single conversation, is also contributing to this kind of much more rapid propagation of certain kinds of ideas. And I think that this is your expertise, not mine, but it's like our brains evolved on the savannah, and we're just not quite like ready. Like maybe young people are keeping up, but I'm now at the point where I'm like the old man on a lawn, being like, okay, I'm stuck in the language of like whatever it is, 2010, and that's what I'm going to use from now on. And it's like oh wait, like how did I become like angry about changing culture? And of course, like culture always changes, but it's like the speed of it makes it hard. It's exhausting at some level.
Yeah, and it will continue to be exhausting because of one paradox that lies at the heart of the human condition today, which you touched on. And I think to remember this when you analyze problems is really useful, is that we evolved in the savannah in very small groups. So our psychology is a psychology of a small group. So in that sense, that is the sense in which we are social apes. And we have coalitionary psychology. Who are my friends? Who are my enemies? Who can I collaborate with in order to take over the other guys? Who is trying to like take me on over by my status? We are obsessed about this coalitionary psychology all the time, and people are also displaying their virtue over certain issues in order to signal, hey, I belong to this coalition. To which coalition do you belong? So on and so forth. That means that our psychology is made for a small group in which we expect we will have long-term interactions, we will reciprocate, you owe me a favor, but I will repay maybe in a different way 10 years down the line, but my family, my friend, therefore the friend of my friend is my friend, all of these kind of things. And that works in small groups, but of course we have that combination today that we are social apes in small groups, but we're also ants or social insects, i.e. that we live in a world that will have 8 billion people very soon. And that fundamental paradox, I think, is at the heart of most of our challenges today. Because how do we tackle a world with 8 billion people at the global problems that we have with a psychology that is made to basically favor my friends and family? And we could take it from there. But that paradox of being ants and apes at the same time, I don't think will go away.
That leads into the next part of this conversation, which is about cancel culture, and which is obviously a very fraught term. But Omar, you had kind of a run-in indirectly with this last year.
So I published this paper on as was just mentioned, on protests, and it came out just a few days before George Floyd was killed. And so it got caught in this sort of national conversation about protests. And on a night when there were a lot of protests in one city, a data scientist tweeted about my paper.
It might be helpful to just explain a little bit what the paper was
Sure.
about.
So I spent 15 years studying what kinds of protest tactics were effective for the civil rights movement in the 1960s. And took a bunch of different data and tried to say, like, at the county level, when there was a nonviolent protest, did that shift voting behavior? When there was a violent protest, did that shift voting behavior? And what I found was that nonviolent protests actually had a kind of liberalizing effect. People voted more for the pro-civil rights coalition. And when there were violent protests, people voted more for the anti-civil rights coalition. So to be clear, like historical data, 1960s, but sort of felt very topical last year. So a guy named David Shore, who's a data scientist who follows the research on things like what changes voting behavior, tweeted a link to my paper and said, hey, I recommend reading this paper. It kind of speaks to the current moment. And there was this pile-on against him where people were saying, oh, you're being critical of people going out and expressing their anger. You're being insensitive to the degree of grief and that people feel. And sort of there's a back and forth. And ultimately, a week later, he was fired from his job. And that became kind of one of the, in a discussion about cancel culture, that became one of the key stories. So I'm it's not about me, but it's sort of like my research was the kind of like minefield for him. And so I thought about this, in a couple of different ways. And let me add one coda, which is that like 2 weeks ago he was, interviewed in a very prominent profile in the New York Times and says that while it was terrible at the time, like it's actually over the arc of his career, it's been good because he's now like 10 times more famous than he was before. And so that in some ways speaks to kind of, I think, both sides of this issue, which are that it is, going back to that context collapse thing, right? Like a group of data scientists, right? I have a master's in statistics, like the kinds of points he was raising, which are kind of technical. There were like two conversations happening. One was this like very emotional conversation about this profound level of anger and grief. And he was sort of saying like, well, but if you look at like, table 4, regression 3, it points out that the coefficient is such and such. And people are like, no, like you don't get it, right? And for a group of like academics to have that kind of conversation would be totally reasonable in a kind of bloodless way, but that's not the conversation that was happening on Twitter that night, right? And so that's two different registers of emotion and kind of analysis colliding, and the very real cost to him of losing his job and potentially being smeared as somebody who was a bigot, and at the same time, also what we see again and again, particularly for celebrities, is that like being canceled can be good for your career, and that it's sort of like controversy can generate media, and it's sort of a there's no such thing as bad press sort of story. And I'm not trying to say that's true for everybody, particularly people who aren't famous. So now to get to maybe an idea that I think is useful, which you'll again have more insight on this. But I think part of what we miss in the larger conversation about cancel culture is that all culture has boundaries, right? And it's like no matter what community you're in, there are rules that you can violate that would cause you to be kind of excommunicated from that community. And so it's not that so cancel culture is at some level like human culture. And I think what's different now is that, like, again, it's kind of like we're having this debate on it. We're trying to come up with one standard for everybody, right? Which is what the context collapse sort of forces. And that's unworkable in a big, diverse country. And so it's like, I want us to both recognize, like, human culture demands norms, demands boundaries. And at the same time, like, we need to allow for pluralism and a broader range of norms in our country, or it's just not going to work.
Yes. I agree. Again, I see the paradox there of basically cancel culture is like a small group of 150 individuals trying to impose their own specific rules on 8 billion. And of course, there are many groups and then whoever yells harder will win. I worry a lot about cancel culture. I worry that it will make us stupid, literally. Because I studied playing animals, and studying playing animals has been very interesting in the sense of changing what I thought about risk and kind of almost waste, in the sense that if you look at how creativity and innovation happen, creativity and innovation are down the line from play behavior, because play is this like intrinsic activity that takes elements, combines them, you do it for fun, you don't know if it's going to work, it's not going to work, you're not doing it for a purpose, you're not being paid for it, as to say. And a lot of stuff goes nowhere. We just had a good time, that's it. We climbed the hill, we went dancing, we played with ideas, nothing came out of it. But when we look at the inventions of creativity, both in science, in arts, in any endeavor, and innovation, we can see that often they are the products of some sort of process that had play there. What I'm trying to say is that if we then try to norm the kind of risk and outcome that is inherent to the nature of play, I think we become stupid, in the sense that we don't feel free to play with ideas, to play with, well, also humor, of course. And we live in this world where we are scared. Again, looking at animals is very interesting. When they're playing, the first thing that they will stop when there's a potential threat is play stops. So play is super volatile to fear and stress for good reasons, right? Because obviously you don't want to be playing when there might be a lion coming. There are priorities. But I think what we need to understand is that because we have language, and now our language and social norms have been amplified by social media, it is as if we're living with the threat of the lion constantly. So we are in this constant arousal of stress state that are like, okay, did I say something bad? Am I going to get cancelled? Is somebody tweeting something bad about this? Has my career stopped? Will I ever be able to get back again? And so, yeah, I'm not a fan of cancel culture. And I think human interaction, also I trust humans more than the necessity of having to norm every interaction. I think I trust our ability to sort our own stuff when we are given the conditions. I think this intention of trying to make a protocol for to make safe interactions is doomed and it's not workable. But maybe I'm just feeling particularly pessimistic about it.
Let me add two things, right? So one is, I think it's important to appreciate though that I just want to underline that having norms is also profoundly human.
Oh yeah. Sorry.
We there are all of us have some minimum standard of I expect to be treated with respect, or I expected to be talked to with a certain amount of regard, right, for my humanity. And so the tension is where
is that, let me clarify, I didn't mean norms as in having norms. What I've seen, and maybe it's because I'm an academic and I'm seeing it a lot in the university setting, is that specific interactions are normed, i.e. there's a protocol. And I see the bad effect. For example, before, as a young woman, I could have, old professors that usually they are higher in the hierarchy, so you could actually be mentored. And now I see that if I'm an old professor, I will not mentor. I would not mentor because then, he might be cancelled and so on. And so that's what I meant. That there's the over protocolization of interactions. Not, of course, we have social norms. That's part.
The other thing, though, on the play part, just I went to Harvard and had friends at MIT, and they used to share a line about innovation, which was, if you wanted to know the future of technology, look at what graduate students are doing when they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing.
Yeah. So they're playing.
When they're playing, they're inventing the future. When they're doing their classes, they're they're kind of learning the past.
Yeah.
So what we've talked about the drawbacks of social media. Is there any benefit to having 8 billion people connected? What is the benefit to having 8 billion people connected? Because it can't be all negative.
I think it's all bad.
Really?
Have you seen the T-shirt where it's there's a classic kind of Ascent of Man where it's there's the chimp, and then there's it's kind of on fours, and then there's an ape that's kind of on 2 legs, and then there's man, and there's sort of this idea of we are evolving to become smarter, better primates, and then in this T-shirt version there's somebody hunched over a keyboard. And as the last image, and it's and the slogan is "Somewhere something went terribly wrong." But no, I'm joking. A couple of places where I think social media is a profound good, right? I think the thing that is the flip side of the speed of culture is also kind of in some ways the speed of ideas, right? And if we look at the history of progress, it's in many ways, it's about ideas. There's a book, the subtitle is, How Ideas Have Sex, right? And it's like there are these people come together from different worlds, they exchange ideas, and innovations happen, and like that's progress in the kinds of recombinations that happen. And so, like, a small example, I'm working on a paper now that I've been working on for the last 2 years, where it had been a seed of an idea in my head. Somebody said, hey, we just published this like large data set on education in the US in the 1920s. And it's like, that's the data set I needed. And like that has led to me doing a bunch of work with a co-author. But it's like, if I hadn't been on Twitter, there's no way I would have seen that data set released, right? And so the speed of cross-pollination is accelerating. And that's, I think, fundamentally advancing society in all sorts of important ways. One other way I think that can be useful, my wife had a chronic illness for many years, and there's a kind of indictment of online activism, sometimes called slacktivism. And it's like, you could be, and there's a great book by a guy named Eitan Hirsch called Political Hobbyism. Actually, the title is Politics is for Power, and it's an indictment of what he calls political hobbyism, where a lot of us, we like to watch the news, or we go on social media, but we don't actually do anything that has any material benefit for anybody. And so he's critiquing that. And there's been other work that again critiques this kind of idea of slacktivism. Well, there are a whole lot of people who are homebound, who don't have access to going to marching in the street or meeting their politician. And for them, and this was, my wife helped organize this patient community, online, the online spaces are life-saving, right? It's like the point you talked before about isolation. There are people who spend 23 hours a day in bed, and but for the online worlds, it would be like solitary confinement, right? And so I think I think we forget about all sorts of edge cases where people might, all sorts of kind of cases that may not be part of our routine lives, but where the opportunity to find the people like you and not feel alone is genuinely life-saving.
Yeah, I don't think it's all bad. It's I was thinking maybe it's like the Force. It has a dark side, but it also has a light side, and it keeps the universe together, right? And I think we have talked plenty about the dark side. One of the very important light sides is what you touched on. The book When Ideas Have Sex is by Matt Ridley, who's also animal person. He started as a zoologist, and he's written many popular science books. And we have looked at, again, the emergence of creativity and innovation in history, and what you see is that it's this ecosystem of collisions. Basically, when different networks come together, when different people come together, when different ideas come together, new things may arise. That's why, places like, festivals and any kind of I think what we will experience this weekend, it's also an ecosystem of collisions. So the internet is a big place for that. The other one you mentioned is basically the possibility of creation of finding your tribe for many people. I think that's real in a world where social networks in the real life are geographically separate. The internet has a fantastic benefit. When I was in Oxford, we did a study looking at the longevity of friendships, namely because the assumption being we are social primates, we bond in person when we go to the pub, that's a very British thing, you share food, drink, laughter together, that's how you make friends, and that's how you maintain friendships. So if you look at studies at that map, when people leave the place and go to study or work somewhere else, inevitably, like in radioactive material, you see a decay in the strength of friendships. One of the things that, say, Facebook and other networks do is that they slow that decay. They allow for the longevity of friendships. It's questionable as to whether they allow for creation. We think probably the role is more in maintenance. Once you have already hanged out, probably we would have never, made friends in the online world, but now, you meet in real life, you have dinner, you say jokes, and then you go okay, we might stay in touch and keep that friendship. And so that's another huge benefit. And of course, I think education and learning And even though we can get very tired of Zoom, I think we also the benefits, particularly again for older people, FaceTiming their grandchildren and so on. It is not like the real thing, but it's better to have that than not to have it. I think.
It's interesting you bring up Facebook, because I think one thing that we haven't really addressed is kind of the difference between these different kinds of social networks. You have Twitter, where there is this culture collapse, or I'm sorry, there's this context collapse.
Yeah.
Where you're speaking to a global audience.
Yeah.
Whereas something like Facebook, you have a much more curated group of people that you're speaking to. And again, one thing we've seen over the last year is when you are just speaking to that small group of curated people that you start to see problematic information and misinformation start to spread. And how can we maintain these smaller groups without having those negative consequences?
I struggle with this. I have good friends from high school who I now am just like, I mean, the short answer is I use Facebook less. And it's not, and these are people I think I'm fond of, but I just don't want to have certain kinds of interactions. And it's like, and I don't, and maybe that's my mistake for like, I don't know, not having, I need better hobbies or something. I need to talk about like, my dog or photography or something. But it's like, in some ways, Facebook has become a place where I'm actually less comfortable talking about, I don't know, I'm interested in nuclear power. And it's like, I sort of don't talk about politics on Facebook anymore. Mm-hmm. And on, as compared with Twitter, I feel very comfortable, even though weirdly it's global. It's like not, somehow it's not like as intimate, and the lack of intimacy gives me a little bit more freedom. So I don't have an answer for that. I think that's, I mean, one other thing though, I think that is useful to flag here, going back to this idea of the handshake in the unstable norm or rule around a handshake, is that cultures have transitions, right? And so there was a moment, I'm going to show my age, but I feel like I'm not too much older than this room, right? Like there's a moment where the answering machine is invented, and it's considered rude to have an answering machine answer your phone instead of you answering the phone, right? And so there's this like period where it seemed like you're screening the call, like that's obnoxious. And then it flips, and I call and you don't have an answering machine, and it's like, that's rude. Like I want to be able to leave you a message and you don't have an answering machine, right? And I think we're in one of these moments where it's a little unclear, like what is the expectation? And I think we will settle into something more like, I think in the transition, it's really unstable and hard to know what to do. Elbow, hand, fist bump, but we will converge to something.
Social norms. I think we are in an exciting time and a dangerous time too, because if you look at like the evolution of different technologies, this has happened before, namely that a new technology emerges and then we extrapolate the impact of that technology. It happened with, the printing press and books. It happened with radio, radio killed the TV star, and it happened with TV and so on. And we have evolved social norms, how to use them. We're not, watching television 24/7. Ideally, in Victorian times, you were not reading your Jane Austen book in the table during dinner. You were expected to close it. I think we are evolving a very similar social norm around dinner time. Even like not just putting the phone on the table, but actually keeping it away from sight. Because we are social animals and we are hackable animals, but we're also cultural and we change. We shouldn't assume this condition of stasis. There are things that will change, but there are also things that will not change. I think to try to get our minds clear on what will change and what will not change is actually very, very useful and a workable proposition. And the basic thing that we can remember there is that what will not change is our social nature, that we are cultural, that we evolve rules, and also that we are physical animals, therefore we need to sleep, we need to move, we need to see each other in person at some point, etc. The point of that is that I think we will evolve these norms, that they are already happening. Yes, that's it.
Isabel, Omar, thank you so much for
Thank you.
spending time with us.
Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you. Thank you.